She kissed me in front of 800 people, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. That kiss, that single moment under the auditorium lights with the whole school watching, was the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to me up to that point in my life. And it was also the beginning of the worst thing anyone has ever done to me. I have spent years trying to figure out how both of those things can be true at the same time. I think I finally understand it now. But it took losing everything to get there. My name is Mason. I grew up in a town in Ohio that people from bigger cities drive through without stopping. The kind of town where the main street has 3 churches, a diner that's been there since 1974, and a dollar store that replaced whatever used to matter. We weren't the poorest family around, but we were close to it. My father worked construction. He got up before 4 in the morning every single day except Sunday. He had hands that were cracked and calloused in a way that no amount of lotion could fix, and he didn't complain about it once in 18 years. Not once. My mother worked the checkout lane at a supermarket about 2 miles from our house. She wore a red vest with a name tag every day. She smiled at strangers for 8 hours straight and came home with her feet hurting and still made dinner. Those 2 people are the reason I am still standing today, and I want that on the record before anything else. We lived in a 2-bedroom house. I shared a room with my younger brother Nolan until I was 15, and he moved to a pull-out couch in the living room because I needed more quiet to study. He never complained about that either. My family was made of people who absorbed difficulty without making it into a performance. That was what I grew up around, quiet endurance, the belief that if you worked hard enough and were smart enough, the world would eventually notice. That belief was everything to us. It was the operating system of our household, and I internalized it completely. I discovered debate by accident in the 8th grade. My English teacher, a woman the school called Ms. Patterson, not her real first name, she always said, just what she'd answered to for so long it stuck. She made us watch a recorded presidential debate one afternoon when the projector in the history room was broken, and she needed to fill the period. I sat there watching 2 men argue with structure, with evidence, with deliberate pauses and calculated tone, and something happened in my brain that I can only describe as recognition, like seeing something for the first time and knowing you already understand it. I raised my hand at the end and asked her what that skill was called. She said it was called rhetoric. Then she said, "Mason, you should look into the debate team." I did. I showed up to the first practice and got destroyed. The kid who beat me in my first practice round was a junior, named Adrian Knightley. He was confident and fast, and he had clearly been doing this for years. He made me feel slow and unprepared, which I was, but I didn't leave. I came back the next day and the day after that. I started reading at night. Not novels, arguments. I read transcripts of Supreme Court cases. I read editorials and dissected how they constructed logic. I watched old debate recordings on YouTube and took notes on structure, not content. Within 4 months, I had won my first school-level round. Within a year, I had made the varsity team. By the time I was a junior at Westfield High School, debate was not just something I did. It was who I was. It was my identity in a school where identity mattered enormously, and most of mine was working against me. I didn't have the right clothes. My backpack was from a discount rack at a pharmacy. I brought lunch from home every single day because the cafeteria was too expensive and we all knew it. Other kids didn't mock me openly. The school wasn't brutal in that way, but there was a social stratification that everyone understood without saying it aloud. You knew your tier. You knew where you sat and who talked to you and what the ceiling of your high school experience was going to be. I knew mine. Debate was the only room in that building where my tier didn't apply. In that room, all that mattered was your argument. The National Debate Championship for high schools was not just a prestigious event. For students like me, it was a life-altering mechanism. I want you to understand this because it is the foundation of everything that follows. The top 3 finishers at the national level received formal letters of recommendation co-signed by 4 major universities, including 2 schools that were otherwise nearly impossible to get into without family connections or a $100,000 application consultant. Along with those letters came full scholarship commitments, tuition, housing, books, and a small stipend. For a kid whose parents were trying to figure out if they could afford a used car to replace the one that kept dying in the winter, this was not an abstract achievement. This was the difference between a life like mine had been and a life I had only seen on television. I want you to sit with that for a second before we keep going. Put yourself in that position. What would you have done to protect that chance? And what would you have done when someone took it from you? I spent my junior year working toward the national qualifier. The regional competitions were the first filter. Our school had never sent a student past regionals before me. I made it through. I won the regional qualifier in March of my junior year with a prepared argument on immigration policy that I had rebuilt 7 times from scratch until every piece of evidence was verified and every transition was clean. My coach, who had been skeptical of me when I first joined the team, stood up in the gymnasium when the decision was announced and shook his head in a way that meant he was surprised and proud at the same time. My parents drove 90 minutes to watch that round. My father sat in the bleachers in the jacket he wore to church because it was the best thing he owned. When I looked over at him after the decision was announced, he was holding his hands together in his lap and staring straight ahead, and I could see from the tightness around his jaw that he was trying not to cry. I had qualified for the state competition, which meant I was now in the pool of students who could advance to nationals. The state competition was held in Columbus in November of my senior year. Between the regional win and Columbus, I spent every available hour preparing. I read position papers from think tanks. I built counter-arguments against myself. I practiced delivery in front of my bathroom mirror until 11 at night. My brother Nolan would sit outside the bathroom door sometimes and listen and then tell me which parts sounded boring. He was the most useful critic I had. But here is where the story changes. Here is where she enters. Her name was Tessa Patterson. And if you grew up anywhere near a school like mine, you already know exactly who Tessa Patterson was, because every school has one. She was the girl the entire institution seemed to organize itself around. President of the Student Council, homecoming court for 3 consecutive years. The kind of person who walked into a room and the room rearranged itself. She had the kind of confidence that didn't come from effort. It seemed ambient, built into her the way height is built in. She was genuinely beautiful, which I say factually and without sentimentality. She had long, dark hair and a way of making eye contact that made you feel like she'd been thinking about you specifically. Half the boys in school had been in love with her at some point. Several of them had told me so, unprompted, the way people confess things they've given up on. I had spoken to Tessa Patterson exactly twice before my senior year. Once, when she asked me to move my backpack off a chair in the library, and once when she stopped at my table in the cafeteria to ask if I knew what the chemistry homework was. Both times I answered her, and she walked away, and that was the entirety of our relationship. We didn't move in the same circles. We barely moved in overlapping universes. She was the center of the school's social world, and I was somewhere in the outer rings. Known but not significant. That was accurate, and I had made peace with it. So when she showed up at the debate practice room in September of my senior year, 2 weeks after I had won the state qualifier and secured my spot in the national competition, I was genuinely confused. She knocked on the door frame. The practice room didn't have an actual door, just a room with folding chairs, and said, "Is this where the debate people are?" I was the only one there. My coach had left 20 minutes earlier. I said yes. She came in and sat down across from me and told me she had watched my state qualifier performance on the live stream the school had posted. She said she thought it was impressive. She said she'd had no idea debate could be like that, could be so intense, so personal. She said I was the most compelling speaker she'd ever seen from our school. She asked me questions, real questions, about how I prepared, about how I chose my positions, about what it felt like to stand in front of a panel of judges with everything on the line. I answered every single one. I was 20 minutes from going home to a dinner my mother had made with ingredients she'd bought with a careful budget. I was tired and I still had 4 hours of prep ahead of me that night. But I sat there and I talked to Tessa Patterson for 45 minutes because she was interested in something I had built, and nobody who looked like her had ever been interested in me for any reason at all. I'm not proud of how simple that was, but it was honest. She came back the next day, and the day after that, within 2 weeks, she was texting me every evening. It started as questions about debate, terminology, strategy, the rules of the national format. Then it became conversations. She would send me articles and ask my opinion. She would describe situations at school and ask how I would argue them if they were a debate topic. She was curious and engaged, and she laughed at the right moments. I started looking forward to her texts. By October, I was checking my phone before I checked my notes. Let me tell you something that I have only told 2 or 3 people in the years since this happened. The night before the auditorium event, the debate showcase the school ran every October for parents and the community, I barely slept. Not because of nerves about the debate, because I was thinking about whether Tessa would be in the audience. That is how thoroughly she had gotten inside my head in 6 weeks. I had gone from a person who thought about nothing except arguments and evidence to a person who was tracking the seating chart of a school auditorium for signs of a girl, and I did not recognize what was happening to me at the time. I thought it was just what it felt like to have someone pay attention to you. I thought that was what this was. The October showcase was a formal event. The school treated it as a preview of national-level talent, and parents came from all over the district, teachers dressed up. The auditorium, which usually smelled like industrial cleaner and old basketball sneakers, had been set up with a podium and real lighting. There were chairs for close to 800 people, and most of them were filled. My parents were in the 5th row, my father in his good jacket again. I gave the best speech of my life that night. It was a 12-minute prepared argument on international trade policy and the domestic workforce, and I had built it over 3 months and knew every sentence by memory. I didn't read from notes. I moved on the stage. I made eye contact with the judges and then with the audience. I used pauses the way I had learned to use them, not as hesitation but as weight. When I finished, the room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, and then the applause started. My coach was standing, and then Tessa Patterson walked onto the stage. She didn't have a microphone. She didn't say anything to the judges. She walked straight to me in front of 800 people, put her arms around me, and kissed me. The crowd erupted. There is no other word for it. The sound was immediate and enormous. People were cheering. Teachers were laughing. I heard my mother somewhere in the audience make a sound I had never heard her make before. And I was standing on a stage under a spotlight with Tessa Patterson's hands on my face and the whole world watching, and I had no idea, none, that this was the most precisely calculated moment of her life. I want you to tell me in the comments, if you had been standing on that stage, would you have seen it for what it was? Because I didn't. I was 17 years old, and someone extraordinary had just kissed me in front of everyone I knew, and all I could think was that something had finally gone right. We were a couple after that, not because we discussed it or decided it, because the school had already decided for us. By the next morning it was fact, Tessa Patterson and the debate kid. That was what people called us in that order. Her name first, because she had more gravity. I didn't mind. I was too happy to mind anything. The next 6 weeks were the best and most dangerous weeks of my life, and I did not understand the second part until much later. She came to every practice session. She sat in the back of the room with her homework spread out, and looked up to watch when I ran through arguments. She helped me with timing. She had a stopwatch on her phone, and she would hold up fingers to signal me when I was running long. She brought food sometimes, energy bars and those little bags of crackers, because she said she'd noticed I never ate much before practices. I thought that was tenderness. I cataloged it as evidence of how she felt about me. I built a case for her the way I built cases for debate. Evidence, pattern, conclusion. The conclusion I kept reaching was that she cared about me. I was so good at arguing that I convinced myself. She also asked questions. This is where I need to be precise, because the questions changed. In the beginning, the questions were general. What's the format? How many rounds? What topics do nationals cover? Normal questions for someone learning how debate worked. But around late October, the questions got specific. Not to the sport, to me, to my specific preparation. What's your strongest argument for the semifinal position? Which statistics are you planning to lead with in the final? How are you structuring your closing if the judges have a conservative lean? I answered all of it. Every time, I was proud of how hard I had worked, and I wanted to show her. I wanted her to see the architecture of what I had built, because I had built it to be seen by someone who mattered to me. That was the trap, and I walked into it with both feet. Let me tell you about the national competition structure, so you understand what was at stake. The National High School Debate Championship that year was held in Chicago. It ran over 3 days. The preliminary rounds were held in separate rooms with rotating judges. The quarterfinals and semifinals were held in larger conference rooms. The final was held in the main auditorium, broadcast on the organization's live stream, and attended by representatives from 6 major universities, including the 4 that had pledged the scholarship packages. The topic for that year's national final was announced 2 weeks before the competition. It was a question about federal education policy and standardized testing. I had been preparing for 3 possible variations of this topic for 4 months. I had files, binders, a spreadsheet of every piece of relevant federal data going back to 1990. I was ready in a way that I had never been ready for anything in my life. 1 week before we were supposed to leave for Chicago, something happened at school that I registered at the time as nothing. I only understood what it was much later. Tessa mentioned during one of our evening texts that she had decided to enter the public speaking showcase that the school ran adjacent to the national debate calendar. This was a separate event, a regional public speaking competition that ran on the same weekend as the national debate tournament. It was a much smaller event. It did not offer scholarships, but it was attached to the same organizing body. I thought nothing of it except that it meant we would both be in Chicago that weekend, just at different venues. I thought that was nice. We could meet for dinner on the Saturday evening. I actually started looking up restaurants. I left for Chicago on a Thursday morning with my coach and 3 other students from the school who were competing in individual events. Tessa left with a different group, the public speaking contingent, chaperoned by a different teacher. We texted on the drive. She sent me a photo of her coffee. I sent her a photo of my binders. She sent back a laughing emoji. Everything was fine. Everything was completely fine. The preliminary rounds on Thursday went perfectly. I won both of my rounds cleanly. My first opponent was a kid from a school in Michigan who had a strong rhetorical style but weak evidence. I dismantled his sourcing in the cross-examination and the judges rewarded it. My second round was harder, a girl from Texas who was sharp and fast, but I outworked her on the closing argument and took the decision 3-2. My coach found me in the hallway afterward and shook my hand and said, "You're going to the final." He didn't say it like a prediction. He said it like it had already happened. Friday morning I won my quarterfinal. By Friday afternoon I was in the semifinals. My semifinal opponent was a senior from a private school in Connecticut. A kid named, I will use the name from the list, a kid I will call Blake, because that is the name I can use here. And what I can tell you is that he was the second best debater I had faced all year. Tall, composed, from a school with a debate program that had professional coaches and a budget. He wore a suit that fit him. I wore the one blazer I owned, which my mother had altered at the waist the year before, because it had belonged to someone older. Blake was good. He was genuinely, impressively good, and I beat him, cleanly, on substance, 4-1. When the decision was announced, I stood up from the table and I felt something move through me that I had never felt before. Not relief, not surprise, certainty, the kind that comes from knowing you earned something. I was in the national final. I called my father from a hallway stairwell outside the conference room. It was 7 in the evening. He picked up after 2 rings. I said, "Dad, I made it." He said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "I know you did." And then neither of us said anything for almost 30 seconds, and neither of us needed to. That night, I went over my final round material for 3 hours. The final was scheduled for Saturday at 2 in the afternoon. I had my closing argument memorized to the syllable. I had 7 minutes of prepared material and 10 possible variations of my cross-examination approach, depending on which direction my opponent took the argument. I went to sleep at midnight. I woke up at 7. At 9:45 on Saturday morning, I was eating breakfast in the hotel restaurant when my coach came to my table with an expression on his face that I had never seen before. He was a man who was almost always calm. He had been coaching for 11 years. He had seen everything. The expression he had that morning I can only describe as uncertain. He sat down across from me, and he put his hands flat on the table, and he said, "Mason, there's a situation." He told me that the tournament director had requested a meeting. There had been a complaint filed against me. Someone had alleged that I had access to the final round questions in advance, and had used that access to prepare specifically for the final topic, rather than preparing for a range of topics as all competitors were required to do. The organizers needed to meet with me before the final could proceed. I remember putting down my fork. I remember the sound of other people in the restaurant eating and talking. I remember the way the light came through the window and fell across the white tablecloth. I felt very cold, not afraid, not yet. Just cold, the way you feel when something has shifted and you can't yet see what it's become. "Who filed the complaint?" I said. My coach looked at the table and said he wasn't certain of all the details yet. He said we needed to go to the meeting. We went upstairs to a conference room on the 4th floor. 3 people were sitting at the table. The tournament director, whose name I never learned, a woman from the organizing body's ethics committee, and a man who I was told was a representative from the legal team that the organization retained for exactly these kinds of situations. The tournament director told me that a formal complaint had been filed by another competition participant. He said the complaint included printed documentation, screenshots of text message conversations, that purported to show me telling someone the specific questions that would be used in the final round. I said, "That's not possible. I never had access to those questions." The tournament director said he understood my position. He said the process required them to investigate any formal complaint before the final could proceed with a flagged competitor. He said the printed messages showed a conversation between my number and another number, and that in those messages I had described specific elements of the final round topic in enough detail to suggest advanced knowledge. I said, "Can I see them?" He slid the papers across the table. I looked at them, and here is the thing that I want you to understand. The messages looked real. They were formatted exactly the way a screenshot of a text conversation looks. The number on one side was mine. I recognized my own number. The messages attributed to me discussed the final round education policy topic in specific terms. They referenced statistics I had actually researched. They discussed a structural approach to the argument that mirrored my preparation. But I had not written them. I had not sent them to anyone. I had never described the final questions in any conversation because I did not know the final questions. Nobody competing knew the final questions. That was the entire design of the competition. I said all of this clearly and without panic. I said, "These messages are fabricated. I don't know how someone created them, but they are not real conversations." The ethics committee woman asked me if I could explain why the messages discuss specific details of the education topic with apparent confidence. I said I could, because I had studied that topic extensively for 4 months, and it had been the most likely final subject. I had covered it in conversations with my coach, with my teammates, and with people in my personal life. The details in those messages were not evidence of advanced knowledge. They were evidence of thorough preparation. The tournament director nodded. He said he understood. He said the process still required a temporary suspension from the final round while the investigation was conducted. He said if the investigation cleared me, I would be reinstated. He said this process typically took 24 to 72 hours. The final was in 4 hours. I said, so I'm disqualified. He said, you are temporarily suspended pending investigation. But those words meant the same thing. The final was happening in 4 hours, and I was not going to be in it. My coach tried to argue. He said the evidence was circumstantial, that fabricated digital messages were a well-documented phenomenon, that the organization had a responsibility to the integrity of the competition to ensure they weren't acting on manufactured allegations. The woman from the ethics committee listened politely and said the process was clear. The tournament director said a replacement finalist would compete in my place. He said they were sorry for the difficulty. They walked out of the conference room and left me sitting at the table. I sat there for a long time after everyone else left. My coach stayed. He put his hand on my shoulder and he didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, I could hear the city. Somewhere in that city, my slot in the national final was being handed to someone else. I finally thought to look at my phone. There was a text from Tessa. It said, "Good luck today. I know you're going to be amazing." It had been sent 40 minutes before the meeting. I stared at that text for a very long time. Then I put my phone face down on the conference table. I went back to my room. My coach said he was going to pursue every formal channel available and that this wasn't over. I nodded. I sat on the edge of my hotel bed, and I opened my laptop and I found the live stream link for the national final. At 2 o'clock, I watched the final happen without me. The replacement competitor was a student from my regional bracket, a kid who had lost to me in the semifinals and who now, by the strange mechanics of what had just happened, was standing in the spot I had earned. The final started. Opening arguments, cross-examination, rebuttals. And then, about 90 minutes into the broadcast, the woman who was competing on the other side of the topic from my replacement delivered her closing argument. Her name was listed in the program as a public speaking competitor, making a guest presentation as part of the event's new cross-discipline initiative. That was how they had gotten her into the room. It was Tessa. She stood at the podium and she delivered a 12-minute argument on federal education policy and standardized testing. And as I watched on my laptop screen in a hotel room in Chicago while the city moved outside my window, I heard her say things I had said to her. Not paraphrases, not similar points, the same sentences, the same statistics, in the same order with the same framing. The argument structure was mine. The evidence pattern was mine. The closing line, a quote I had spent 2 weeks tracking down from a 1983 Senate hearing, was mine. Word for word, she won. Not the debate tournament. She was a guest. The format didn't allow for that. But she won something. She won the public speaking showcase, which was the competition she had actually entered. And the judges from the universities were in that room. And they heard her argument. And 3 weeks later, I found out that she had been offered a full scholarship to one of the 4 universities, not through the debate championship track, through a separate merit evaluation process that the university had conducted based on her performance that weekend. Meanwhile, my name appeared on the official results page of the national championship under a section labeled Disqualified. I went back to school the following Monday, and I lasted 3 days before I asked my parents if I could transfer. I told them I needed a fresh start. I didn't tell them the full truth of what I understood about what had happened. I didn't know the full truth yet, and I couldn't make them see it without the evidence. My father sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a long time. My mother stood by the sink and didn't turn around. They had believed in this tournament the way people believe in things they can't afford not to believe in. It had been the plan, and the plan was gone. We found a school in a neighboring district that would accept me for the second semester. I finished my senior year there. I graduated. I was accepted to a state university on partial scholarship. My grades were strong enough for that much, but the full ride, the letters of recommendation from the prestige schools, the launch trajectory, none of that was there anymore. I started college with a half scholarship and a part-time job, washing dishes at a sports bar 3 nights a week. I want you to tell me something in the comments. When you lose something that was supposed to change your life, what do you do with the anger? Because I'm going to tell you what I did. And it took me a long time to get there. But first, you need to understand what the first year was like. The first year after the disqualification was the worst year of my life. Not because of poverty. I'd always been poor and I knew how to navigate that. It was the other thing. The specific, irreversible knowledge that I had been cheated by someone I had trusted. That is a different kind of wound. It doesn't heal the way physical things heal. It changes the tissue. You are not the same person you were before it happened. I started college in January. I enrolled in a general studies program because I hadn't had time to plan properly. My college applications had all been built around the scholarship pathway, and when that collapsed, I had to scramble. State University, dormitory room with 3 other people, a bunk bed I was assigned by default because I arrived mid-year. I worked my dishwashing shifts on Tuesday, Friday, and Saturday nights. I studied in the library because the dorm room was too loud. I was 18 years old and I felt like I had already failed. I also kept turning the disqualification over in my mind, the way you press a bruise. Not obsessively. I had too much to do to be obsessive about anything. But the detail that wouldn't settle was the evidence, the printed messages. The tournament director had said they were printed screenshots. I had been shown them in that conference room. They looked real. And I had spent enough time with digital evidence by that point, research, sourcing, documentation, to know that fabricating a text conversation was not simple. You couldn't just type something out and photograph it. The formatting had to be right. The metadata had to look correct. It required either a technical process or access to an actual device. There was only one device that could have plausibly been the source. Only one person who had my number, who had discussed the debate content with me in specific terms, and who had been in Chicago that weekend. I knew this. But knowing it and being able to prove it were different things, and I had nothing concrete. I had only the logic of it, which is compelling to the person who sees it and meaningless to everyone else. The dormitory was a place called Hartwell Hall, which was one of the older buildings on the State University's campus, and smelled perpetually of old carpet, and the cleaning solution they applied to old carpet to make it smell less like old carpet. My room was on the 4th floor. The elevator was broken the first 3 weeks I lived there. I climbed 4 flights of stairs with my bags on the day I moved in. My roommates, I had 3 of them in a 4-person suite, were a kid from Cleveland who played video games at high volume starting at 10 in the morning and going until 2 at night. A kid from a suburb of Cincinnati who was studying engineering and who I rarely saw, because he was always in the computer lab, and a 3rd kid, a quiet person named Adrian Caldwellson, who had transferred mid-year like me, and who was studying accounting and who ate cereal at every meal because, he told me once, it was the most cost-effective food per calorie that didn't require preparation. Adrian and I understood each other in the specific way that people who are navigating identical economic realities understand each other. We didn't discuss it explicitly. We didn't have to, you know. When someone is calculating whether to get the meal plan or the cheaper plan with fewer swipes. When someone wears the same 3 shirts in rotation with no apology. When someone turns off the light in their room before leaving for class. Not because they've been raised to conserve energy on principle, but because they know the utility bill is real. You know when you're sitting next to someone whose family is living close to the margin, and you feel less alone, not because the margin is a good place to live, but because at least there is someone who knows the terrain without you having to explain it. Adrian and I ate in the dining hall together most evenings. We talked about whatever, his accounting classes, my general studies coursework, the news, sports. We didn't talk about what had brought us to mid-year enrollment. He had his reasons and I had mine, and the implicit code of the situation was that you didn't ask. But one night in February, during a dinner that consisted of the dining hall's Tuesday pasta offering and a conversation that had started nowhere in particular, he said, You seem like someone who's trying to get out of something." I said, "Yeah." He said, "What kind of something?" And I told him. Not all of it, not the specific mechanics of the fabrication, but the shape of it, the tournament, the disqualification, the scholarship that had evaporated, the school transfer, the sense of having been standing in a specific place and having the ground pulled out from under you by someone you had trusted. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he ate some pasta and then he said, "I got expelled from my last school for something I didn't do. Different situation, same feeling." He shrugged. "It follows you around." I said, "Does it ever go away?" He looked at the table for a second. Then he said, "I don't think it goes away. I think you build something that's bigger than it. And eventually the proportion changes." That was the most useful thing anyone said to me in my first year of college. I have thought about it many times since. The proportion changes. Not the wound, the proportion. You build until the wound is a smaller percentage of the total. That is not the same as healing. But it is something. I worked the dishwashing job at the sports bar through the entire first year. The bar was called Fletcher's, and it was approximately a mile from campus, on the kind of street that has a laundromat and a bail, bondsman and a convenience store, and then, somewhat incongruously, a sports bar with decent wings. I worked 3 nights a week, Tuesday, Friday, and Saturday. Tuesday was light, regular dinner crowd. Friday and Saturday were the nights that the kitchen produced its maximum output of dishes, and you stood for 5.5 hours at the commercial washer feeding plates and pots and sending them through, and pulling them out the other side. My hands smelled like the industrial soap they used in the washer. My feet ached in a way that I recognized from hearing my mother describe her cashier shifts. I understood her differently after 6 months at Fletcher's. I understood a specific kind of physical tiredness that accumulates in your lower back and the arches of your feet and becomes a kind of baseline you stop noticing because there's no point noticing it. The manager at Fletcher's was a man named Hector Iverson. He was about 45 and had been running the bar for most of his adult life and treated his employees with a flat, business-like fairness that I came to respect enormously. He wasn't warm. He wasn't mentorial. He paid on time. He scheduled people the way they asked to be scheduled when he could, and he did not tolerate theft or abuse of other staff. That was the entirety of his management philosophy, and it was sufficient. He noticed that I came in exactly on time, that I never called out sick when I wasn't sick, and that I did not cause problems. After 6 months, he gave me a small raise without my asking. I thanked him. He said, "Don't come in late." I said I wouldn't. That was the full extent of our relationship, and I would have trusted him with most things. The job funded the gap between my partial scholarship and the actual cost of attending. It was tight, but it was manageable, which meant it was better than many situations I had seen, and I was grateful for it, even on the Saturdays when I stood at the washer until midnight and then had to walk back to campus and study for 3 hours before sleeping. You make the calculation every time. What does this cost me versus what does it produce? The math worked, so I did it. In the spring semester of my first year, I made a decision about my academic direction. I was enrolled in general studies, which meant I was taking distribution requirements without a declared major. I had courses in history, writing, social science, and an introductory economics class that I found considerably more interesting than I expected. The economics instructor, a graduate student who taught the section while the professor who ran the class focused on research, was a person named Eric Goodman, young and precise, and he had a way of presenting material that I recognized from my debate training. He structured arguments. He built from premises. He anticipated counter-arguments and addressed them before they were raised. I stayed after class once to ask him a question about market regulation, and we ended up talking for 40 minutes. He said at the end of the conversation, "You should be in law, the way you think about rules." I said I was considering it. He said, "Don't just consider it." That conversation, combined with the realization I had already been moving towards about the mechanisms of institutional processes and their exploitation locked me into the pre-law track. I declared my major at the end of the spring semester, applied for a transfer into the appropriate program, and was accepted for the following fall. The acceptance came with a small additional scholarship, not enough to change the math significantly, but enough to reduce the Friday and Saturday shifts at Fletcher's from 5.5 hours to 4. That mattered more than it sounds. My second year was the year I started to find the thing I was building, not the career. That would come later, the practice of the thing, the habit of reading in the specific way that law requires, not for story, not for argument, but for the structure behind the argument. What is the rule? What is the exception to the rule? What is the exception to the exception? How does the exception interact with the rule in the specific circumstance at hand? This is not how most people read. It is tedious at first, before it becomes automatic. But when it becomes automatic, it changes something in how you experience almost every situation that involves people making claims about what is true or what is allowed. You start hearing the rule and the exception simultaneously. You start seeing where the gap is before the person making the claim has finished making it. I joined the university's moot court team in my second year. Moot court is a competition where law students argue simulated appellate cases in front of judges, including sometimes actual judges, using real legal procedure. It is debate for lawyers. It is argumentation with citation requirements and formal brief preparation and the full apparatus of legal reasoning rather than general rhetoric. I was, if I am being honest, excellent at it from the beginning. The skills I'd built in high school debate translated directly and immediately into moot court competence, and the legal training I was accumulating gave me the conceptual framework to move beyond mere rhetorical skill into genuine legal analysis. By my third year, I was the team's top competitor. We won the regional moot court competition that spring. The judges commented specifically on the quality of my brief and my cross-examination technique. There is a photograph from that regional competition that my mother keeps in the house. I am standing with two teammates outside the courthouse where we competed. I am wearing a suit that I bought second-hand from a thrift store and had tailored by a dry cleaner near campus who charged $20 for alterations. The suit fits well. I do not look like someone who bought it second-hand. I look like someone who knows exactly what they are doing standing in front of a courthouse. My mother saw that photograph and said, "You look like a lawyer." She said it the way my father had said he knew I made the final, like it had already happened. The year after I graduated from my undergraduate program, I was accepted to law school. Not the most elite program in the country. I did not delude myself about where I was in the national pool, and the scholarship options at the elite schools for someone without connections were limited, but a solid regional law school with a strong clinical program, and a faculty that included 3 people whose published work I had already read. I was accepted with a partial scholarship. The gap was smaller than undergrad had been. I had saved some money from the job, my parents contributed what they could, and I took loans for the remainder. The loans were a number I tried not to look at directly. The way you don't look directly at the sun. I knew they were there. I knew they were manageable over time. I did not think about them at night if I could avoid it. Law school orientation happened on a Thursday in late August. I sat in a wood-paneled auditorium with approximately 140 other incoming students and listened to the dean, a woman named Lillian Montgomeryson, give a speech about what the next 3 years would require of us. She was direct and not unkind. She said the rate of cognitive change law school produces is faster and more total than almost any other graduate experience, and that the people who managed it best were the ones who stopped fighting the change and started working with it. She said the first year would feel like running in a language you didn't know. The second year would feel like running in a language you were learning. The third year would feel, possibly, like running in a language you spoke. She was right about the first year. It felt exactly like that. I had been a strong undergraduate student. I had been a strong moot court competitor. I sat in my first contracts class and felt more lost than I had felt in years. Not because the material was beyond me, it was not, but because the method was entirely unfamiliar. Law school teaches through cases, not concepts. You read the case. You understand what happened. You extract the rule. You understand why the court reached that rule from those facts. Then you apply it to new facts that are slightly different, and you determine whether the rule holds. It sounds straightforward. It is not. The cases are long. The facts matter in ways that are not always obvious until they are explained. The rules are rarely clean. And the professor will call on you at any moment and ask you to defend your reasoning in front of 60 people who are also trying to figure out what they are doing. I was called on in my first week by a professor named Felix Davidson, who taught property law and who had a reputation, accurate I quickly learned, for being both brilliant and ruthless in his Socratic method. He called on me on the third day of class and asked me to explain the holding of a case we had read. I explained it. He asked me what would happen if one fact were different. I said what I thought. He said I was wrong and why. He called on someone else. I sat with being wrong in front of 60 people, and I paid close attention to why I had been wrong, and I never made the same error again. That was the pedagogical method. It was not comfortable, it was effective. By the end of the first semester I had found my footing. By the second semester I had found something more than footing. I had found the specific intersection of law that felt like home in a way that nothing had since debate. Evidence law. The law of what can be admitted, what can be challenged, what constitutes sufficient documentation, how courts evaluate authenticity, how fabrication is detected and prosecuted, how institutional processes handle contested documentation. Evidence law was the system that governed the mechanism by which Tessa had destroyed me. I studied it with a focus that the professors noticed. Professor Davidson, who had humiliated me in the third week of property class, told me at the end of the second semester that I was the best evidence student he had seen in 4 years. I thanked him. He said, "Don't just be good at it in class." I didn't know yet what he meant. I figured it out eventually. The second year of law school brought a clinical requirement, actual work on actual cases under faculty supervision. I was assigned to the school's public interest clinic, which handled civil cases for low-income clients who couldn't afford representation. The cases were modest: landlord-tenant disputes, small claims matters, benefits appeals, document questions, but they were real. Real people with real problems that depended on real documents and real process. The first time I sat across from a client, a woman in her 60s named Nadine, who was fighting an eviction based on a lease agreement she believed had been altered after she signed it, and told her I was going to review her documentation and give her my honest assessment, I felt the full weight of what it meant to do this work. She looked at me with an expression that combined hope and skepticism in equal parts. She had reason for the skepticism. She had been failed by processes before. I reviewed her lease agreement, and I found what she thought I'd find. The original signature page had been photographed and reprinted with altered terms above it. The paper stock in the signature section was microscopically different from the rest of the document. The font kerning in the altered clauses was inconsistent with the original by 0.3 points. I wrote a report. The clinic professor filed a motion. The eviction was dismissed. Nadine shook my hand when we told her. She had a very firm handshake. She said, "Thank you, young man." I did not tell her that I had personal reasons for being exceptionally good at finding altered documents. I just said it had been my pleasure to help. That case showed me two things. First, that the skill I was building had direct, immediate utility to real people in real situations. Second, that the work of examining a fabricated document, regardless of the context, produced in me a specific kind of alert focus that I did not experience in other kinds of work. My brain moved differently in front of a question document. It was the closest thing to a calling I had ever identified. The third year of law school I spent primarily on law review, editing articles, writing my own, and on an advanced seminar in digital evidence authentication that had been added to the curriculum by a professor who had been a forensic consultant for 15 years before returning to academia. His name was Gavin Goodman, and he was the first person in an academic setting who spoke about fabricated digital evidence the way I had been thinking about it since Chicago. He treated digital documents not as neutral transmissions, but as objects with fingerprints, with histories, with the traces of every hand that had touched them. He said in the first session, "Every digital object wants to tell you where it's been. Your job is to ask the right questions." I took more notes in that seminar than in any other class in law school. I submitted my final paper, the one that was eventually published, with more confidence than I had submitted anything else. When I graduated, I had 3 job offers. I've told you which one I took, but I want to tell you about the one I almost took, because the almost matters. The second offer was from a mid-sized firm in Chicago that did plaintiff-side litigation. Good reputation, real work, competitive salary. I flew to Chicago for the interview. I sat in the firm's conference room on the 41st floor of a building on Michigan Avenue and looked out at the lake, which was gray and enormous, and I thought about being 24 years old and needing a fresh start in the best possible way. A good job, a major city, a new chapter. The firm was willing. The salary was solid. The work would have been meaningful. And then one of the partners, a woman named Crystal Henderson, who ran the firm's litigation practice, asked me what kind of cases I was most interested in. I said evidence authentication and institutional accountability. She nodded. She said, "We do some of that on the employment discrimination side. Are you open to general litigation as the base?" I said yes. And then I thought about it for the rest of the interview and the entire flight home, and I realized that yes was not accurate. I was not open to general litigation as the base. I was interested in exactly one thing, and I needed to find the place that did exactly one thing. General litigation would have been fine. It would have been more than fine, but it would have been a different story. And I had a specific story to be inside of, even if I could not have articulated it that clearly at the time. The Nicholson Group was the right place. The work was the right work. And the first year was, as I said, foundational in the truest sense. Not exciting, not visible, not the version of the story that gets told later. It was the year of understanding how institutional investigation actually runs. The pace of it, the process of it, the discipline of not moving until you have what you need. Oscar Nicholson ran a tight operation. He did not tolerate shortcuts, and he did not reward urgency over accuracy. He had a phrase he used when young analysts brought him preliminary findings. Good enough is the enemy of correct. He meant it. The first time I brought him a preliminary report that I knew was solid, but that I had flagged 2 remaining verification points on, he handed it back and said, "Come back when the 2 points are verified." I came back 3 days later. He said, "Now, this is a report." In my first year, I worked on 7 cases in a supporting capacity. In my second year, 10 cases, 2 as lead researcher. In my third year, I led 4 cases independently and contributed to 8 others. The variety was important. The cases covered different industries, different document types, different mechanisms of fabrication. Each one taught me something specific. A healthcare case taught me about electronic medical record metadata and how it interacted with facility server logs. A financial case taught me about the gap between a document's claimed creation date and the actual date tracked in its audit log. A political case, the one Gavin had been reading about at lunch, taught me about the specific challenges of authenticating documents that had been intentionally anonymized and then leaked. Each case added a layer to the thing I was building, the practice of the thing, the fluency. By year 4 at the firm, I was the person that Oscar called first when a case involved questions of digital document authenticity. That was not a title. It was a functional reality. When a new case came in that touched on fabricated digital evidence, my name was the one that went on the intake form. I had become what I had set out to become, not just a person who understood the law of evidence, but a person who understood the object of evidence. The thing itself. I still wash dishes in my mental life. I mean this metaphorically. I still operated with the basic orientation of someone who knows what it costs to produce something from very little, who checks the math twice before spending, who does not assume that any position is permanent. My apartment in Columbus was comfortable but not expensive. I owned a car that was 8 years old and ran reliably, and that I had paid cash for because I did not want a car payment. I saved aggressively, not out of fear, but out of the knowledge that financial stability is a form of leverage, and leverage is a form of freedom. I had learned that lesson watching my parents operate without leverage their entire lives, watching every small setback become a significant problem because there was nothing cushioning it. I did not intend to live that way. Not out of resentment toward my origins, I was made from those people and I loved what I was made from, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that freedom requires resources and resources require discipline. My social life in those years was limited and deliberate. I had a small number of people I trusted. Gavin, from the firm, a woman from law school named Ingrid Bennetson, who had become a genuine friend, and who called me on my behavioral patterns in a way that I found irritating and useful in equal measure. My brother Nolan, who had moved to a city in Indiana and was building something of his own. I went on occasional dates. A few of them were good experiences. None of them became lasting. I was not particularly forthcoming in those conversations. Not because I was guarded exactly, more because the habit of containment that I had built in the years after the tournament had become structural. I could be warm, I could be engaged, I could be present, but there was a layer underneath all of it that had learned to stay still, and it stayed still with everyone who was not on the short list. Ingrid said to me once, after the third time a person I had been dating mentioned that I was difficult to fully know, "Mason, the thing you're protecting isn't worth as much as you think it costs you to protect it." I sat with that for a long time. I still sit with it sometimes. I don't think she was wrong. I think the cost of what happened to me was not just the specific things I lost, the scholarship, the tournament, the trajectory, but the general tax on trust that was levied afterward. When the person you trusted most thoroughly is the person who destroyed you most completely, the epistemology of trust breaks down. You don't stop trusting people exactly. You start trusting a smaller number of people more thoroughly and maintaining a greater structural distance from everyone else. That is not a healthy equilibrium, necessarily, but it is a functional one, and I was more interested in functional than healthy for a long time. The years between the tournament and the forum, 9 years, 11 months, and some days, were not a waiting room. I want to be clear about that. They were not the pause before the real story. They were the real story. The career, the skills, the discipline, the quiet mornings in my apartment drinking coffee before I went to work. All of that was the story. The forum was not the point. The point was what I had become in the years that made the forum possible. I want you to hear that, especially if you are in the long middle of your own version of this. The middle is the point. The middle is where you become the person who can handle the ending. Let me go back to the morning of the forum because I glossed over something important. I woke up at 6:15. My hotel room was clean and quiet and faced east, and the light that came through the curtains was the particular quality of March light. Pale, thin, present without being warm. I had slept reasonably well, which surprised me. I had expected the kind of restless night that comes before important things. What I got instead was a full 7 hours and a clear head, which I took as information about where I was mentally. When you're still fighting something, you don't sleep before the confrontation. When you've already made peace with what you're going to do, you sleep. I showered. I made coffee with the hotel room machine, which was not good coffee, but sufficient. I laid out the materials on the small desk, the file folder with the submission form, the forensic report, the printed excerpts from the audio recording's transcript, and a single page of notes I'd written for myself that was not a script, but a structural map. I would not read from it, but I had found over the years that having a structural map in front of me, even one I didn't look at, was a grounding mechanism. It told my nervous system that the architecture was sound. I ate breakfast in the hotel restaurant, eggs and toast and more of the insufficient coffee. I sat alone. A few other conference attendees were at nearby tables. I recognized 2 of them from the forum registration list. I did not approach them. I read the news on my phone and thought about nothing consequential. At 8:45, I sent a text to Colin Davidson. He was not at the forum. There was no reason for him to be there, and some reason for him not to be. His formal statement was in the file. His role was already played. The text I sent him said only, "Today, thank you." He responded 20 minutes later, "You've got this. Let me know how it goes." I put my phone in my pocket and went to the forum. I arrived early enough to walk through the venue. The Henderson Policy Forum was held in the university's main conference center, a building that was modern and glass-heavy and connected by a walkway to the university's main library. The auditorium, where the keynote sessions would be held, was on the 2nd floor. I walked through it before anyone else arrived. It seated approximately 600, with a wide center aisle and a fixed podium at the front. The microphone stand for the discussion period was already set up in the center aisle, approximately 15 rows from the front. I looked at it. Then I went and got more coffee. The morning sessions were, as I said, genuinely good. A professor from the University of Minnesota presented research on equity gaps in standardized testing that was methodologically solid and clearly argued. A policy director from a national education nonprofit presented a framework for measuring institutional accountability that I found interesting in a professional context. I took notes on both. I was present. I was not performing presence. I was actually there, because the topics were real, and the people presenting them had done real work, and they deserved actual engagement. During the lunch break, I found the 3 journalists. One was already there, moving through the dining area with the particular alertness of a reporter who is attending an event they expect to produce something. Her name was Faith Armstrong, and she had been covering education accountability for a major regional publication for 7 years. I had spoken with her twice before, professionally. She saw me come in and gave me a small nod. That was sufficient. The second journalist, a man named Blake Jenningson, who wrote for a national outlet's education desk, found me at a table near the window. He sat down and said, "You're still planning to do this?" I said yes. He said, "You have everything you said you had?" I said yes. He said, "Then I'll have my recorder on." He stood up and moved away to get his food. The third journalist hadn't arrived yet. She came in 15 minutes before the afternoon session began, slightly flustered in the way that people who are always arriving slightly late carry with them as a signature. Her name was Jolene Patterson. No relation, she had told me when I first contacted her, with an edge in her voice that suggested she found the name coincidence irritating, and she covered institutional accountability for a publication that specialized in higher education. She found me near the auditorium entrance and said, "Tell me again that this is real." I said it was real. She looked at me for a second and then said, "Okay." The afternoon session began at 2. I took my seat. I have already described what happened, but there is a detail I left out. During Tessa's speech, approximately 20 minutes in, she made a reference to a case study about a student who had been wrongfully accused of academic dishonesty and had overcome it to build a distinguished career. She used the case study to illustrate a point about the importance of institutional due process. I wrote the word case study in quotes on my legal pad and underlined it twice. It was either the most extraordinary coincidence I had ever witnessed, or it was not a coincidence. I still do not know which it was. I cannot ask her, and I do not intend to. When she finished her speech and the applause settled and the host announced the discussion period, and I stood up and walked to the microphone, here is what I felt. Nothing dramatic. I have been asked this many times, and I want to be honest about it. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel rage. I did not feel the specific emotional weather that is usually assigned to a moment of confrontation. What I felt was work, the particular quality of focused attention that comes when a task that has required long, careful preparation is finally being executed. The professional feeling, the one that says, this is what the preparation was for, do it correctly. I did it correctly. Afterward, when I had returned to my seat and the room was still in the particular held silence of people trying to determine what had just happened, I felt one thing that was personal and that I had not expected: relief. Not the relief of confrontation, the relief of accuracy. I had described what had happened exactly as it had happened. I had presented the evidence exactly as it existed. I had not editorialized. I had not performed. The account was accurate, and accuracy was the thing I had spent 9 years building the capacity to produce. That was the relief. Not that the confrontation had happened, that it had happened correctly. The 3 weeks after the forum were professionally busy in a way that I had anticipated, but that was still demanding. The media coverage required responses and fact-checking. The university's review process required a follow-up submission of supplementary documentation. The debate organization's formal review required a separate package of materials prepared through a slightly different legal framework. I was doing this work while also managing my regular caseload at the Nicholson Group, because cases do not pause for personal reckonings. Oscar, to his credit, gave me 1 week of adjusted schedule to address the immediate response period. After that week, he said, "You're back on full load." I said I understood. I was back on full load the following Monday. There were other responses I had not anticipated. A number of people who had competed in the national tournament that year, competitors who had seen the coverage and recognized the event, reached out through my professional contact page. Some of them had not known me, some had. One of them was a man I'll call Blake Caldwellson, who had competed in a parallel division of the tournament that year, and who had remembered the announcement of the disqualification with a feeling of confusion that he had never entirely shaken. He wrote a long message describing what he had experienced, and saying that the coverage had clarified something that had troubled him for 9 years. I wrote him back. We exchanged 3 or 4 messages. I do not know if we will maintain contact, but the exchange was real, and there was my coach, my high school debate coach, who was now retired and living in the same town he had always lived in. He had seen the coverage. His daughter had sent it to him. He called my parents' house, which was the number he still had for me, and my father gave him my number, and he called me directly. He said, "I want you to know I always believed you." I said I knew. He said, "I should have fought harder." I said, "You fought correctly. You fought within the process. The process wasn't the problem." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You turned out all right." I said, "I had good coaching." He made a sound that was half a laugh. Then he said, "Come and see me, sometime." And I said I would, and I meant it. I went to see him 2 months after the forum. We sat in his living room for 3 hours and talked about debate and law and what it means to build an argument versus what it means to build a case. He was sharper in retirement than he had been in the building. He said the best thing anyone said to me about the forum: "You didn't argue, you documented." He nodded like that distinction mattered. It did. It was the entire difference between what I had done as a 17-year-old and what I had done in that auditorium. At 17 I had argued. I had said, "These messages are fake. This is wrong. I didn't do this." I had emotion and logic and no documentation. In the auditorium I had documentation. The argument was inside the documentation. It didn't need my voice. The forensic specialist at the firm, Dana, said something similar when I thanked her for the report. She said, "The document makes the case, you just delivered it." I said she was being modest. She said, "I'm not. Delivery matters. But the document has to be real first. Yours was real." She paused. It was a good case to work on. I asked her why, given that it was small compared to the corporate and political cases we usually handled. She said, "Because it was personal to someone. You work differently on personal cases, cleaner somehow." I thought about that. I think she was right. I cared about the accuracy of that documentation in a way that went beyond professional standard. Not because I was less disciplined, because the discipline was motivated by something more than professional obligation. The truth I was documenting was mine. That made me meticulous in a way that mattered. I need to tell you about one more thing, one more moment, which happened 3 weeks after the forum, and which I have not shared publicly until now. I was walking back to my office from lunch, a regular lunch, a sandwich, nothing special, and I passed the store window and caught my reflection, and I stopped. I don't know why I stopped. I wasn't looking for anything, but I stood there for about 30 seconds looking at myself in the glass. I was dressed like what I was, a professional in his early 30s with a job he was good at. I looked functional. I looked capable. I looked like someone who had built something real. And for the first time, in as long as I could remember, when I looked at that reflection, I did not see the boy who had been escorted out of a tournament hallway while the rest of the competition went on without him. I saw what I had made from that, and those were different things. Not unrelated. The second had been constructed entirely from the material of the first, but different, separate. I stood there for 30 seconds and then I went back to work. That was the real ending, not the forum, not the apology message, not the network dropping her or the university opening the audit. The real ending was a store window on an ordinary street on an ordinary day, and a reflection that finally looked like only one thing. I do not know what Tessa Patterson is doing now. I have not searched for her name since the month after the forum. I did not make that decision formally. I did not say to myself, I'm going to stop tracking her. It simply stopped being something I did. The file closed. Not because I forgave her. I'm not certain I have done that in any meaningful sense, and I am not going to tell you I have in order to give this story a cleaner ending, but because the file's purpose was complete. It contained what it needed to contain. There was nothing more to add to it and nothing to gain from returning to it. I left it on the shelf the way you leave a closed case, with the awareness that it is there if you need it, and the intention of not needing it. My father asked me, the last time I saw him, whether I was happy. He had a particular way of asking things that stripped away the versions of answers you normally give, the ones where you say doing well or can't complain. He looked at you when he asked, and he waited, the way he had learned to wait for heavy things to settle, the way a man learns patience when he works with his hands in weather. I thought about the question for a moment. I said, I think I'm satisfied. He nodded like that was the right answer. It was the true answer. Satisfaction is what you have when what you have built matches what you intended to build. Happiness is something else. Lighter, more ambient, less structural. Satisfaction is what remains when the work is done and it was done correctly. That is what I have. Satisfaction. Built from everything the 9 years produced. Built from the nights at Fletcher's and the moot court competition and the law review article and the cases at the Nicholson Group and the 63 pages of forensic documentation and the microphone stand in the center aisle of an auditorium where the truth was returned to the room where it had been destroyed. It is enough. It took a long time to get there, and it cost things that do not return, but it is enough. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done with 9 years? What would you have built? Because that is the real question underneath all of this. Not what she did, what you do with what she did. That is the question I had to answer every day for 9 years, and the answer I kept choosing, imperfectly and stubbornly, and sometimes with less grace than I would have liked, was more. I will build more than this. I will become more than this moment. I will not let the worst thing that happened to me be the defining thing about me. That is a choice. Not a feeling, not a talent, a choice. Made over and over on the days when it was easy and the longer days when it was not. Make the choice as many times as it takes. That is all I know for certain. That is the only thing I would change nothing about. I was 27 years old, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus that I rented alone for the first time in my life, earning enough to send money home to my parents every month when I heard Tessa Patterson's name again. It was a colleague of mine at the firm, a senior analyst named Gavin Edwards, who mentioned her. We were at lunch, a sandwich place near the office we both went to regularly, and he had his phone out and was scrolling through something, and he stopped and said, "Do you watch political commentary at all?" I said sometimes. He said, "This woman is good. She does these long-form video essays about leadership in public institutions. Tessa Patterson. You heard of her?" I said the name was familiar. He didn't notice anything in my face. I have had years of practice at keeping my face still. He turned the phone around and showed me a thumbnail. A woman with long dark hair, direct eye contact, professionally lit, and said, "She's doing a talk at the Henderson Policy Forum next month. Apparently, she's a big deal in education policy circles." Then he put his phone away and ate his sandwich. I went home that evening and I sat at my kitchen table and I found her online. She was, as Gavin had said, a big deal. She had a presence across multiple platforms, long-form video essays that got hundreds of thousands of views, speaking engagements at universities and policy conferences. A published book, I found the listing easily, on leadership and institutional integrity. The book was titled, with an irony that I felt physically, something along the lines of Building Trust in Public Life. She had been interviewed on 3 cable news networks and one podcast that I knew had a listener base in the millions. She presented as thoughtful, composed, quietly confident. Her argument style was good. It was actually good. She had developed into a genuine public intellectual over the decades since high school, and everywhere she spoke, the same themes appeared: honesty and leadership, the responsibility of public figures to maintain integrity, the corrosive effect of deception on institutions. I sat with that for a long time. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I expected to feel rage. I had felt rage before, in the years after the tournament, in the late nights studying when I would think about her standing on that stage with my arguments in her mouth. But sitting at my kitchen table at 27, looking at her book listing and her speaker page and her polished headshots, what I actually felt was something colder and more specific than rage. It was clarity. The kind of clarity you get when something that has been slightly out of focus for a long time suddenly sharpens. I looked at her career, the scholarship she had used to get into a prestige university, the credential that university gave her, the platform that credential had built, and I understood that every single piece of it rested on a foundation she had built with my material, not metaphorically, literally. The argument that had impressed the university judges enough to grant her the scholarship was an argument I had written. The credential she had used to launch this career in public integrity had been purchased with fabricated evidence and my stolen work, and she was out there talking about honesty. That was the night I decided to do something, but I want to be precise about what I decided, because this is where I made my first major mistake, and it cost me more time and more peace than anything else in this story. What I decided that night was to act quickly. I pulled out everything I still had from the tournament, my preparation files, my notes, my research documents, and I started building a case. I contacted the National Debate Organization and asked about their records retention policy. I tried to locate the Ethics Committee report from my disqualification. I wrote a formal request for documentation under the organization's records policy. The organization responded 3 weeks later with a letter saying that records from competitions more than 7 years prior were archived, and that retrieval would require a formal legal request. I considered that route. It was slow, it was expensive, and there was a larger problem. Even if I retrieved the records, what did I have? My coaching on this from everything I had learned professionally was that documentation of what I didn't write was not sufficient. I needed documentation of what she did write, or rather, what she fabricated. The gap in the tournament records was the absence of proper authentication of the evidence she'd submitted. Proving the absence was not the same as proving the fabrication. To make this case, I needed to find someone who had direct knowledge of what had happened, a witness. Not just a witness to the event, but a witness to the mechanism. Someone who had seen something in the process that created a chain of custody to her. And I did not have that. I had logic. I had the pattern of events. I had the overwhelming circumstantial coherence of the story I knew to be true. But circumstantial coherence is not evidence. Every investigation I had ever worked on had taught me this. You do not build a case from what makes sense. You build it from what can be demonstrated. I was letting my urgency, the urgency of having just discovered she was being celebrated publicly for integrity while I knew what she had done, push me toward acting before I had what I needed. That urgency led me to make a mistake. I contacted a journalist, not a major outlet, a regional investigative reporter I knew professionally who covered education and institutional policy. I told him I had information about a prominent education commentator that I thought was significant. I did not give him her name yet. I told him the outline of the story, a national competition, fabricated evidence, a stolen scholarship. He was interested. He asked me what documentation I had. I told him I was in the process of assembling it. He said, "Come back to me when you have the documents. Without documentation, this is just an allegation." He was right. That was exactly right. But in my urgency, I had already tipped my hand to someone else. I had mentioned to a mutual acquaintance in the policy journalism world that I was looking into something connected to the Henderson Forum's upcoming speakers. That acquaintance mentioned it to someone else. It didn't reach Tessa. As far as I know, she never heard about that particular inquiry. But it could have, and if it had, she would have had time to prepare. That was the risk I had taken for no reason, because I had acted on urgency rather than readiness. My coach at the Nicholson Group used to say, "The moment you move is the moment they know you're moving." I had moved. Nothing came of it. But I had been sloppy, and I knew it, and I hated it. So I stopped. I stopped everything. I closed the files. I put the notes away. I went back to work. I spent the next 6 months doing my job and not thinking about Tessa Patterson, or rather, thinking about her in the specific controlled way that you think about a problem you're not ready to solve yet. The way you put a case file aside when you know you're missing a piece and you need to wait for the piece to appear. I was 30 years old when the piece appeared. I had gone home to see my parents for Thanksgiving. My father was in his 60s now and had retired from construction after a back injury. My mother had moved from the supermarket checkout to a part-time position at the same store doing inventory, which she said was easier on her feet. They lived in a slightly better house. We had moved 2 years after I started working, when I could contribute enough to make the difference. The new house had 3 bedrooms and a dishwasher that worked. My mother cried when we first saw it. My father walked through every room twice, with his hands in his pockets like he was inspecting his own work. Thanksgiving in that house was the best day of most of my years. My brother Nolan was there with his girlfriend. My father made a point of asking me questions about my work that I knew he didn't fully understand, but that he asked because he wanted to understand. The kind of attention that costs something. On the Friday after Thanksgiving, I drove across town to have coffee with some people from high school who still lived in the area. It was the kind of low-stakes reunion that happens in small towns. 6 or 7 people at a diner, catching up, the conversation moving through the usual categories of jobs and relationships, and people who had done surprising things, and people who had done predictable things. I was there for about an hour. I had mentioned nothing about Tessa and nothing about the tournament. That part of my history was not something I shared in casual settings. And then someone said her name. One of the people at the table, a woman I'd known slightly from high school named Krista, who had gone on to work in event planning, mentioned seeing Tessa Patterson's name on a conference program somewhere. Someone else said she was doing well for herself. A third person, a quiet man who had been sitting at the end of the table, mostly listening to the others, said, "I always wondered about her." His name was Colin Davidson. I had known him vaguely from high school. He had worked as a student aide to some of the school's administrative programs, including, I now remembered, the competition oversight program that the school had operated in coordination with the National Debate Organization. He had been a background figure, the kid who handled logistics, who printed things, who set up rooms. Quiet, thorough, easily overlooked. I said, "What do you mean you wondered about her?" He shrugged. He said, "Just something I always thought was weird." He looked down at his coffee. Then, he said, I was working as a volunteer assistant for the tournament organizers that year. Junior year, the year of the national final, he paused. I helped process some of the administrative materials that came through for the competition. Something in the room became very still for me. Not the room. The room was exactly the same, but my attention had narrowed to a single point. I said carefully, "What kind of administrative materials?" He said, "Complaints, appeals, that kind of thing." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I know you were in that competition. I saw your name on the list later. The one with the—" He trailed off. "The disqualified list." I said, "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The complaint against you, it came in 3 days before the final. I processed the routing. I'm the one who stamped the date on it." He looked at me for the first time in a while. "And the printouts, the screenshots, they came from her laptop. I know because I had to witness the submission. She had to certify the source. She signed a form saying the screenshots were printed from her own device for documentation purposes." He shook his head. "I always thought that was a weird way to phrase it. Printed from her own device. Like you'd say that unless the messages were on your device." I held my coffee cup in both hands and looked at him. He was still turning his own cup in his hands. Around us, the conversation had moved on to something else, and no one was paying attention to us. I said, "Do you still have any of that documentation, the form she signed?" He said he didn't have it personally. It would have been filed with the organization. But he had been there. He had witnessed the submission. He remembered because the whole thing had struck him as off. The timing, the phrasing, the fact that a competitor in a parallel event was submitting documentation against a competitor in the main event 3 days before the final. He had mentioned it to the senior administrator at the time and been told it was within the rules. I said, "Would you be willing to give a formal statement about what you witnessed?" He looked at me for a long time. I saw him weighing it. He was not a confrontational person. He had not come to this diner looking for anything complicated. He had come for coffee and conversation. I had just handed him something much larger. I said, "You don't have to decide right now. I just want to know if you'd consider it." He said, "Let me think about it." He called me 3 days later and said yes. I want to tell you what those 3 days felt like while I was waiting for his answer, because they are part of the story in a way I have not fully described. I went home from that diner in Ohio, and I went to bed, and I lay awake for about 2 hours, not in an anxious way, in the way that happens when something real has shifted and your brain is trying to map the new terrain. Colin Davidson, a quiet kid who had processed paperwork in a back room and stamped a date on a form and witnessed a signature. He had carried this thing for 9 years without knowing its weight. He had said it at a diner over coffee because someone he half remembered from high school asked a question at the right moment. The chain of it, the sheer contingency of it, was almost difficult to sit with. If I had not gone home that Thanksgiving, if the conversation at the diner had not moved in that particular direction, if he had not been one of the 6 people who showed up, any one of those variables shifted, and that information dies quietly with the person who held it. That is the thing about institutional injustice that nobody tells you. It depends on silence. It depends on the people who saw something deciding it is not their problem to speak about. Colin had not decided that, not actively. He had simply never been asked. And the asking required a specific alignment of time and place and trust that had taken 9 years to produce. That is how long the silence can hold, and that is how fragile it actually is once someone decides to end it. I thought about that during those 3 days. I thought about all the people who had been in that tournament organization and had processed the paperwork and had stamped the forms and had not said anything, and I could not find it in me to be angry at them. They did not know what they had been part of. Colin had not known either, not fully. He had known something was strange. That is different from knowing you are a witness to someone's future being dismantled. You do not know that when you are 17 and volunteering and trying to help things run smoothly, and someone hands you a form to stamp. You do not have the full picture. That is how the mechanism worked. The people at each individual step of the process only ever saw their step. Nobody saw the whole design except the person who had designed it. She had understood that. She had understood that. If she built the complaint correctly, if she timed it right and signed the right forms and used the right language, no single person who touched the paperwork would have enough of the picture to see what it really was. That was sophisticated. That was the thing that I had identified in the law school lecture about contested authentication, the thing I had written about in my first published paper. An institutional process has a specific vulnerability when the person exploiting it knows its mechanics better than the people operating it. She had known. She had known that the organization would accept printed screenshots as evidence. She had known that the investigation timeline could be shaped by the complainant's explicit request. She had known that the ethics committee would process the form, and the committee member would ask a question and get a non-answer and move on. She had understood the process completely and used it as a weapon, and none of the people at the individual steps had the view of the whole. That was what Colin's statement would provide. Not just the specific detail of the timestamp and the signature, the view of the whole. He had been at the step where the form was submitted. I had been at the step where the disqualification was delivered. Between those two steps, in the audio recording of the committee meeting, was the step where the shape of the thing was visible. Together, those 3 points of view created the complete picture. That was what had been missing for 9 years. Not the evidence exactly, the coherence. A single piece of evidence proves a fact. 3 coordinated pieces of evidence prove a pattern. A pattern proves design. Design proves intention, and intention is what transforms a bad outcome into an injustice. Colin said yes on a Sunday morning. He texted me, 2 words, "I'll do it." I read the text while making coffee, and I held the phone for a moment, and then I set it down and finished making the coffee, and I went to my desk and I opened a new document and I wrote, at the top, Case File, Contested Evidence Authentication, Henderson Policy Forum Target Date. Then I started working. That call was the beginning of the real investigation. Not the hurried, emotional, urgency-driven thing I had tried to start 2 years earlier. The real thing. I went back to the Nicholson Group with a personal project request. I asked Oscar if I could use the firm's forensic resources on a historical case that was personally relevant to me. I disclosed the conflict of interest fully. I told him the history, the tournament, the disqualification, the specific mechanism I believed had been used. Oscar listened to all of it without interruption. When I finished, he said, "What's your timeline?" I said I was targeting the Henderson Policy Forum. Tessa was scheduled to speak there in 4 months. The forum was a major annual event, nationally attended, live-streamed, covered by education and policy journalists. If I was going to present findings, I wanted a room where the findings would matter. Oscar said, 4 months is enough if you have the witness and can retrieve the organization's records. I said, I think I can. He said, don't think, no. With the Nicholson Group's resources behind me, the records retrieval process moved faster than my individual attempts had. The firm had established legal channels for requesting archived organizational records. We filed the appropriate requests with the National Debate Organization through their formal archival process, with a legal letter attached, explaining the basis for the request. 3 weeks later, we had a response. The organization's archives from that year's competition were retrievable, including ethics committee records, complaint submissions, and investigation documentation. What we received was a file that I had never expected to hold. The original ethics complaint, with the timestamp Colin had remembered, 3 days before the final, the submission form, with a signature line. The name on the signature line was Tessa Patterson, and in the field labeled Source of Evidence, the entry read, Screenshots printed from submitting party's personal laptop, certified accurate to the best of submitting party's knowledge, printed from her laptop. She had certified it herself. She had signed a form stating that the screenshots used to disqualify me had been printed from her personal laptop. At the time, the organization had accepted this as a transparency disclosure. The submitting party is telling you where they got the screenshots. But it was something else entirely. It was the answer to the question I had carried for 9 years. The messages hadn't been forwarded to her by some third party. They hadn't been obtained through some technical hack of my account. They had been created on her device and printed from her device. She had built them herself. She had certified them herself. And then she had submitted them to destroy me. The document existed. The signature existed. The timestamp existed. That was the gap. She had thought she was being transparent. She had thought that signing a form saying where the screenshots came from would look like honest disclosure. She had not understood that the honest disclosure was a confession. Colin's formal statement confirmed the submission process and the timestamp. We also located, through the organization's archived records, a communications log showing email exchanges between the ethics committee and the organizers in the days following the complaint submission. In one of those emails, a committee member had noted that the complainant, listed by initials only, TP, had been unusually specific in the submission about the timing of the disqualification, requesting that the investigation not be resolved until after the final round had concluded. This was procedurally unusual. Normally, investigations were expedited. This one had been, this deliberately timed to last long enough to remove me from the competition permanently. We assembled the technical report. The firm's forensic specialist, a woman named Dana who was the best in the business at device origin attribution, examined the metadata embedded in the digitized versions of the original printouts. Even in scanned archival copies, metadata traces can survive. She found device fingerprints consistent with a specific generation of laptop that had been common among high school students in that period. She found formatting metadata that was consistent with a particular messaging application being screenshotted on a device rather than received on one. She found timestamp anomalies in the embedded data that indicated the images had been created within a single session on the same device, not received as separate messages over time, but generated in sequence. The report was 63 pages. It was the most thorough piece of forensic documentation I had ever seen assembled on a case this size. And then we found the recording. I want to explain how we found it, because it matters. The National Debate Organization, like most organizations of its size, used a third-party audio recording service to document committee meetings. This was standard practice for ethics proceedings. They needed a record. The recordings were archived, like the documents. When we submitted the records request, we had asked specifically for all documentation, including audio records from committee proceedings related to the case. The organization had complied. They had sent us a CD, yes, an actual physical CD, because the archival system was that old, with recordings from 6 committee meetings that year. The meeting that mattered was the one held 2 days before the final. In that meeting, the committee discussed the active complaints. There were 3 complaints that year. Mine was the third one discussed. What the recording captured was a committee member asking whether the timeline on complaint 3 was unusual, and a senior administrator responding that the complainant had been very clear about the desired outcome, specifically that the complaint be processed before the final round, and that the investigation conclusion be withheld until after the competition concluded. The committee member said, "Is that something we can do?" The senior administrator said, "The rules don't prohibit it." The committee member said nothing further. The recording established that the complaint had been deliberately structured to ensure maximum damage, not just to flag a potential violation, but to remove me from the final before I could compete, regardless of the investigation's eventual conclusion. The complaint had been filed not to seek truth, but to achieve a specific procedural outcome. That was the difference between a genuine complaint and a weaponized one, and we had it on tape. Now I had all of it: the signed form, Colin's statement, the forensic report, the recording, 4 months of work, 9 years after the event, and I had built something that could not be dismissed. The question was what to do with it, And this is the part of the story where I made a decision that I want you to think about carefully, because I had options. I could have gone to the media first, handed the package to the journalist I'd contacted 2 years earlier, and let the story run wherever the news cycle took it. That might have been faster. I could have gone to the universities that had granted her credentials and asked for a review. Slower, more uncertain, but institutionally significant. I could have filed a formal complaint with the debate organization itself, seeking a reversal of my disqualification, satisfying symbolically but practically irrelevant a decade later. I chose none of those options first. I chose the room. The Henderson Policy Forum was scheduled for March. The keynote on the second day was Tessa Patterson, presenting a talk titled, and I want you to hear this title because it will stay with you, Honesty and Leadership in the New Generation. The forum was held at a major university in the region. It was attended by approximately 600 people, students, professors, education policy professionals, journalists, and representatives from national education organizations. The talk was being live-streamed on the forum's channel, which had a regular audience of several 100,000. It was exactly the kind of room where truth should be returned to, not because it would be the most efficient mechanism, but because she had built her platform on a stage. Literally, she had stepped onto my stage in front of an audience, and the thing she had taken from me needed to come back the same way, in front of people, in public, in the room where she had chosen to stand. I registered for the forum as a professional attendee. There was no reason for my registration to be flagged. I worked in institutional investigation and policy analysis, which were entirely relevant disciplines. I confirmed my attendance. I booked a hotel near the venue. I prepared my materials. In the week before the forum, I contacted 3 journalists directly. Not broadly, specifically. I chose journalists who covered education policy and institutional accountability. I told each of them that I had credible documentation concerning a speaker at the Henderson Forum that I would be presenting at the open discussion session following the keynote on the second day. I told them I was not asking for coverage decisions in advance. I was simply making them aware so that if they attended the forum, which I knew 2 of them were already planning to do, they would know to have their recording devices ready during the discussion portion. One of them asked me what the documentation concerned. I said it concerned questions of evidence fabrication and credential integrity. She said she'd be there. The night before the forum, I sat in my hotel room and I went through the materials one more time. Not because I needed to, I knew them by heart, but because there is a ritual in the preparation that keeps you grounded, that keeps you connected to why you are doing the thing, and not just what you are about to do. I had spent years learning how this kind of work was supposed to feel. It was not supposed to feel like satisfaction. Satisfaction is a trap. It makes you careless and emotional. It was supposed to feel like precision, like the moment before you close an argument when everything is in its place and you simply need to speak. I thought about my father on a Thursday morning at 4 o'clock, getting up in the dark to drive to a construction site. I thought about my mother in her red vest, smiling at strangers all day. I thought about a gymnasium in Ohio where my father had sat in his good jacket and watched me win something that was supposed to change everything. And then I closed the files and I went to sleep. The forum opened on a Tuesday. I sat through the morning sessions without difficulty. The presentations were good, professional, substantive, the kind of education policy discussions that actually matter to people who work in the field. I took notes on 2 of them that were genuinely interesting. I had lunch at the venue's dining area and sat alone and ate and thought about the afternoon. At 2 o'clock, the main auditorium filled for the keynote session. I sat in the center of the hall, in the middle of a row, surrounded by people I did not know. I had a legal pad on my lap and a pen in my hand. The lights in the hall dimmed slightly as the host introduced the speaker. Tessa Patterson walked onto the stage. She was polished in the way that people who have spent years in front of cameras become polished. The posture, the movement, the way she paused at the podium and let the room settle before she spoke. She was exactly as composed as she appeared in her videos. She wore a dark blazer and she had her notes on a tablet, but she barely glanced at them. She began to speak. I watched her the way I watch evidence, without reaction, without judgment in my face, just watching. She looked out at the audience within the first 2 minutes, a sweep of the room, the practiced move of a confident speaker, and her eyes passed over me and moved on. Then they came back, just for a moment, a fraction of a second, and in that fraction I saw something happen in her face that was too small for anyone else to notice. A tightening, a recalibration, the face of someone who has walked into a room expecting one thing and found another. She recognized me, and then she kept talking as if she hadn't. The speech was 40 minutes. I listened to all of it. She was genuinely a capable speaker. I could not deny that. Whatever she had built in the years since high school, she had built it with real work. She was intelligent. She was persuasive. She talked about the responsibility of leaders to create cultures of transparency, about the damage that institutional dishonesty does to young people, about the need for public figures to hold themselves to the same standards they advocate for. She said, "Trust is not given. Trust is built, action by action, conversation by conversation, over time, and it can be destroyed in a moment." I wrote that sentence down on my legal pad. The applause when she finished was genuine and substantial. The host came back to the podium and said that there would be a 30-minute open discussion period, as was the forum's tradition with keynote presentations. Audience members could approach the floor microphone with questions or responses. There was a microphone stand in the center aisle, about 15 rows back from the stage. The host invited questions. Several people got up in the first few minutes. Good faith questions about policy specifics, about implementation, about research support. She answered them all smoothly. Everything was normal. Then I stood up. I walked to the microphone. I set my legal pad on the small shelf at the base of the stand. I looked at the stage. She was watching me with an expression that I can only describe as controlled. She had had 40 minutes to prepare for this while she gave her speech, and she had used them well. Her face showed nothing. I said, "My name is Mason. I work in institutional investigation and evidence analysis. I want to ask about something you said about trust." I paused. "You said trust is built action by action over time. I'd like to talk about a specific set of actions." I looked down at my legal pad and I began. I did not raise my voice. I did not use emotional language. I did not tell my story the way I might have told it to a friend, with feeling, with color, with the weight of what it had meant. I presented it the way I presented a case file. I described the national debate tournament. I described the complaint. I described the disqualification. I described her winning the public speaking showcase that same weekend, using an argument she had obtained from me through our relationship. I described the signature on the submission form, her signature, certifying that the fabricated screenshots had been printed from her personal device. I described Colin Davidson's formal statement. I described the forensic report. I described the audio recording, each piece in sequence, each piece documented, each piece cross-referenced to a specific item in the file folder I had placed on the shelf next to my legal pad. As I spoke, I heard the sound of the room change. It had started as the ambient hush of a professional audience listening to a Q&A. It became very still. Then it became something else. The active, alert silence of people who understand they are in the middle of something that matters. At the 43rd second of my statement, I saw Tessa's composure fracture. It was small. A slight shift in how she held her head, a tightening around the mouth. She was still standing at the podium. She had not moved, but she was not the same person standing there that she had been 30 seconds earlier. I reached into the folder and I held up the submission form. I said, "This is the form submitted with the complaint against me at the national championship. The signature on this form belongs to Tessa Patterson. The field marked Source of Evidence reads, screenshots printed from submitting party's personal laptop. certified accurate to the best of submitting parties' knowledge. I set it down. These screenshots were not accurate. They were fabricated. The forensic report documenting the fabrication is here. I set the report on the shelf. The recording of the committee meeting at which the timeline manipulation was discussed is here. I held up a small audio player and pressed the button. The recording played for 45 seconds through the room's sound system. The committee member's voice, the senior administrator's voice, the discussion of the complainant's desired outcome. The host reached out toward the microphone to intervene, and then stopped. I saw her stop. She looked at the stage and then back at me, and she stopped because she didn't know what to do, and in that moment of not knowing, she chose to let the thing play out. I said, "I'm not asking this hall to determine guilt or innocence. I'm noting that documentation of these events exists and has been verified, and that it has been made available to 3 journalists covering this forum today. I'm noting that the university that granted a scholarship on the basis of a performance at that tournament has been formally notified of this documentation as of this morning." I paused. "And I'm noting that someone who built a public career on the principle of institutional honesty began that career by submitting fabricated evidence to destroy another person's future." I'd looked at the stage. "You said trust is built action by action. I agree with that. I've been building mine for 9 years, and this is one of the actions." I picked up my legal pad and I walked back to my seat. The hall was silent for approximately 7 seconds. I counted them. Then the journalist moved. "I want to tell you what happened in the next 48 hours because it is important, and because it did not look anything like the movies. It was not a dramatic confrontation. It was not a public breakdown on stage." Tessa Patterson walked off the stage during the questions that followed. There were several more from journalists in the room, and she answered 2 of them before excusing herself and leaving the stage. The forum ended early. The host made a brief statement about the importance of verification and institutional integrity. People left, but the live stream had been running the whole time. By that evening, the clip of my statement had been viewed, I was told, over 200,000 times. The 3 journalists I had contacted had published initial reports. The university that had granted Tessa's scholarship, a real institution with a real investigation process, confirmed by email that they had received the documentation I had sent them that morning and had opened a formal review. The television network that had given Tessa a regular commentary spot called her that afternoon, according to a report that ran 3 days later. They put her appearances on hold pending their own review. Her speaker agency, which had managed her conference bookings, sent a statement 2 days later saying they were pausing their relationship with her while they assessed the situation. And the National Debate Organization, 9 years and 11 months after my disqualification, sent me a formal letter. In it, they acknowledged receipt of the submitted documentation. They stated that the documentation raised significant questions about the integrity of the original complaint process. They stated that they were opening a formal review. They stated that pending the conclusion of that review, my name would be removed from the disqualified competitors list and placed on a list of competitors whose status was under formal review. It was not an apology. It was not a reversal. It was a bureaucratic acknowledgement. But it was the first time in 9 years and 11 months that the organization had treated my name as anything other than a closed file. My mother called me 2 days after the forum. She had seen the clip. My brother Nolan had shown her. She said, "Mason, are you okay?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is it over?" I said, "I thought the important part was." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your father wants to talk to you." He got on the phone. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I watched you." He meant the clip. I said, "Yeah." He said, "You sounded just like you did in that gymnasium." He meant the regional qualifier, the first competition I'd won. 11 years earlier, in front of 800 people, the day he had sat in his good jacket and tried not to cry. I didn't say anything for a second. Then I said, "I know, Dad." In the weeks after the forum, there were media requests. A number of journalists wanted to speak with me. I gave 2 on-record interviews, one to the journalist who had covered the story from the beginning, and one to a legal publication that was interested in the institutional evidence angle. In both interviews, I was careful about what I said. I stated facts. I described process. I did not characterize Tessa Patterson in personal terms. I did not describe her as malicious or calculating, even though I believed she was both. I let the documents do that work. The documents were cleaner than my characterizations, and they would last longer. Tessa's public response to the situation was, from a strategic standpoint, not effective. She released a statement through her publicist that called my presentation a targeted campaign of character assassination, and said the documentation I had presented was selective and misleading. She did not specify what was misleading about it. She did not challenge the signature on the form. She did not challenge the forensic report. She did not address the recording. Her statement was emotionally worded and evidentially empty, which told me, and, I believe, told the journalists and institutions reviewing the case, everything they needed to know about the substance of her defense. The university that had granted her the scholarship issued a report 6 weeks later. The report found that the documentation I had submitted raised credible questions about the integrity of the application process through which she had been admitted and funded. The report recommended a formal audit of her academic record and credentials. The audit, I was told by a source inside the institution, was ongoing. The television network terminated her contract 4 weeks after the forum. Their public statement cited concerns about credibility and transparency that are inconsistent with the standards we hold for our contributors. That was the corporate version of the truth. The actual truth was in 63 pages of forensic documentation. Her speaker agency formally dropped her 6 weeks after the forum. The book she had written was quietly moved from active promotion to the back catalog by the publisher. It did not disappear, but it stopped being pushed. The public career she had built over a decade, the platform, the appearances, the reputation for integrity, began to contract. Not explosively, methodically. The way things built on false foundations contract when the foundation is examined, slowly at first, then all at once. And her conference talk at the Henderson Forum. The clip of my statement was the most watched segment of that forum in its 14-year history. I want to tell you what happened inside me during all of this, because the story is not only about what happened outside, and this is the part that I think matters most, even though it is the hardest to explain. I had expected to feel something when the institutions responded, when the network dropped her, when the university opened its audit, when the organization removed my name from the disqualified list. I had spent 9 years imagining various versions of this outcome, not always consciously, not always productively, but it had been there in the background the whole time. This idea that when the truth came back to the room where it had been destroyed, I would feel a specific thing: relief, vindication, the closure that everyone talks about, as if it is a door that closes and stays closed. That was not what I felt. What I felt was much quieter and much stranger. It was something like watching a clock reset to 0, and realizing that the time before 0 is not recovered by the reset. You can go back to the beginning, but you cannot go back. The years of rebuilding, the law school nights, the dishwashing shifts, the professional work, the careful, patient construction of a life that could stand without the tournament's help. Those years had shaped me into someone specific. They had made me into the person who knew how to find the gap in a fabricated document, who could read an audio recording for procedural irregularities, who could walk to a microphone in a full auditorium and present evidence without losing composure. I would not be that person without those years. I would have been a different person, perhaps easier, perhaps more carefree, perhaps happier in some simple ways, but not this person. And this person was who I had become. This was the cost. This was what she had done to me, and what I had done with it. And you could not fully separate those two things. There is a question I have been asked multiple times since the forum, by journalists, by acquaintances, by People who heard about the story and tracked me down. The question is some variation of, "Do you feel better now?" And I understand why they ask. They want the story to have a clean ending. They want the recovery to be complete. They want me to say, "Yes, I feel better now. The scales have balanced. Justice has been served. The wound has healed." The true answer is more complicated. Yes, the institutional record has been corrected. Yes, the platform she built on the foundation of what she took from me is gone. Yes, the people who matter to me, my parents, my brother, the handful of people I trust completely, know the full story now. Those things matter. They mattered to me, and they change something real in how I carry this. But some things do not close. The years when my name was on the disqualified list do not close. The moment in my hotel room in Chicago, watching her stand at a podium with my arguments in her mouth, does not close. The way my father held his hands in his lap in the gymnasium and tried not to cry over a future that was about to be stolen does not close. These are structural. They are in the architecture now. I do not experience them as wounds that need to heal. I experience them as part of the material from which I was built. I think about something she said in her speech before everything fell apart. She said, "Trust is not given. Trust is built, action by action, conversation by conversation over time, and it can be destroyed in a moment." She was right about that. She was right about destruction. What she didn't say, and I think did not understand, is that rebuilding is different from building. When you build something for the first time, you make choices freely. When you rebuild, every choice carries the memory of the first time. The structure is stronger, often, but it is never the same shape as the original. You cannot rebuild into what you were before the destruction. You rebuild into something new, shaped by the specific way the original was taken apart. I am that rebuilt thing, and I have made a kind of peace with it that I did not expect to find. Not a comfortable peace. I will not tell you this story ends with comfort, because it doesn't, and anyone who says it does is lying, but a real peace. The kind that comes from having done a difficult thing correctly over a long time. 3 months after the forum, I was approached by a former classmate from law school. He worked at a civil litigation firm. He had seen the coverage and wanted to know if I had considered legal action. He said I had a potentially strong case for defamation per se against Tessa. The fabricated messages had directly caused me material damage in the form of the lost scholarship and the disqualified status. The statute of limitations question was complicated by when I had discovered the full extent of the evidence, and there were arguments that the discovery rule extended my window. He thought I had a serious case. I thanked him and told him I would think about it. I thought about it for about 3 weeks, and then I decided not to pursue it. Not because I thought he was wrong about the case. He might well have been right. But because a lawsuit would take years. It would require me to spend a significant portion of my professional and personal energy over the next several years managing a legal proceeding. It would require Tessa to be a central figure in my life for that entire period. And I had spent 9 years making her a peripheral figure in my life, not the center, not the obsession, but a contained awareness, a file that was open at the back of the drawer while I built the front of my life. A lawsuit would put her back at the center. That was not a trade I was willing to make. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, if I'm honest, was not money. It was not even the legal acknowledgement, as satisfying as that would have been. What I had always wanted was the truth in the room where it had been destroyed. And I had that. I had walked into the room where she was celebrated for honesty, and I had laid the truth in the middle of the floor for everyone to see. That was what I had worked toward. That was complete. Let me tell you one last thing about Tessa Patterson. Approximately 4 months after the Henderson Forum, I received a message through my professional contact page. It was short. It said, "I don't expect you to respond to this. I'm not going to make excuses for what I did. I just want you to know that I'm sorry and that I think about it." It was signed with her name. I read it 3 times. I thought about what my response should be. I thought about it for a day and a half. and then I archived the message without responding. Not with anger, not with coldness, but with a clarity that felt like the clearest thing I had felt in years. There was nothing she could say that would return what was lost, and there was nothing I needed to say that would add anything true to what had already been said in that auditorium. The conversation was finished. It had finished in the room where it needed to finish. Everything after that was noise. The door had closed. Not because I'd forgiven her or because I was done carrying it, but because the book of this particular story had reached its last page, and there is nothing useful to be done with a book that has ended, except to put it on the shelf and understand what it cost you to read it. I am 31 years old. I have a work I am proud of and people I trust, and a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus that I keep quiet, and that smells like the coffee I drink every morning before I start my day. My parents are okay. My brother Nolan still tells me which parts of my arguments are boring, and he is still right most of the time. I send money home on the 1st of every month, and I do not announce it or make it mean something beyond what it is, which is, this is what the years produced, and some of it belongs to the people who made the years possible. I am also not who I would have been if none of this had happened. That is a fact I have learned to carry without bitterness and without romanticizing. The bitterness is a trap, and the romanticization is a lie. What this was hard. What I built from it is real. Those two things exist at the same time, and I have stopped trying to resolve them into something simpler. If you are watching this right now, and you are in the part of the story that feels like the long middle, the part that comes after the injustice and before anything that looks like resolution, I want you to hear me say one specific thing. Not that it gets better, because that phrase has been emptied of meaning. Not that the truth always wins, because sometimes it doesn't, and you should know that. What I want to say is this: the thing you build while you're waiting for the truth to come back is not secondary to the story. The thing you build is the story. The resolution is the proof that the building was real. That is all. That is the whole thing. Tell me in the comments, would you have sent a response to that message? Would you have taken the lawsuit? Because I still think about those choices. I don't regret them, but I still think about them. And I think about the boy in the gymnasium, and his father in the good jacket, and the future they both believed in, and I am glad, whatever it cost me, that I am the person who put the truth back in the room. That's all I have.